Hello and welcome to a breakdown video. My name is Kalen Bonet, also known as Zero Tep. I run a label called Subviolet Records where I release a lot of my own music, and this is a video I've been wanting to do for a little while now. It's a breakdown of one of my own tracks, a complete breakdown from top to bottom, trying to just show you how I made it and explain things. This is a song called Believe You Me. I put it out at the time of making this video probably a month ago, and it was made probably, I guess it was started on 2/9/2019, so that would have been like 2.5 months ago. Definitely one of the faster times that I've finished a track, and so the process was actually pretty simple. As you can see, there's only 34 tracks in use, only 33 of which actually made it to the final product. So it's not terribly complex, and it's mostly stock Ableton with a little bit of isotope trash. I'm pretty sure that's about it. This is my first time recording a video like this, so some of my processes are a little bit rusty. I have to use this complex port routing that you can see down here at the bottom, and I'm hearing my voice on a pretty significant delay, so I might mess up talking because I can hear myself while the music is playing. Forgive that for the time being. I'm sure it'll get sorted out. If you haven't heard this song, Believe You Me, I'm going to play you the first minute or so of it through the drop at the very least, and kind of annotate parts and give you an idea so that you can visually process what's going on. And as we get into it, I'll open up some of these tracks and play sections again and sort of break down how all of these things are built. So let's dig in. A string intro. I don't sample much, but I have this sample pack of royalty-free, sort of almost complete songs and stems. Kinda nice. Pads coming in. Turn myself down a little bit. As you can see, most of this drop is happening in one audio track. Kind of hopping out for other sounds. And as you can see, we're back to these strings again. So there's other components here, but it's not a very complicated song at its heart. The sounds aren't very complicated, but a lot is being done with a little, which is something that I've kind of gotten used to doing, you know. So let's start with this intro, and what makes up this intro. The very first thing is this string sample intro. As you can hear. As I'm playing this pitch-wise, you can kind of hear changes that occur. Not very complicated, but there's a phaser to give it a little bit of life, a little bit of extra width, a little bit of control on the EQ here, and then it's all going into this compressor. Now, the choice to have a compressor at the very end of the track is kind of a way of giving it a little bit of extra warmth and gluing it together, so to speak. If you have a compressor earlier in the sound, that means that you're trying to sort of control the sound first before you apply things like reverb or distortion or something like that. I actually tend to go in the reverse, and I tend to have reverbs first, and I tend to have distortion and compression at the very end. It kind of lends itself to a more wild sound. You get more unpredictable sounds, and then when you're playing those sounds, any mistakes that you might make or any sort of like errors tend to sound a little bit more natural, like a product of the equipment. And I'll show you kind of how that comes into play during the drop here, because, you know, those drums sound very lifelike, and there's a couple of reasons for that. So let's move on. These strings. Let's loop this up. All right, so these strings here are built out of multiple different sections. There's a pizzicato double bass, a pizzicato cello. That means that the strings are actually picked. Simple patterns. They make up the basis of the melodic parts of the track. And then you have some tremolo strings. And they sort of carry over into the trancey synth stabs that are here. Oops, here we go. Now, because I'm terrible at making sounds like this, I actually borrowed pretty heavily from some presets that are built in Ableton, but built out of Wavetable. So a little bit of modulation, but mostly it's just things are just being done with the filter cut off. I'm pretty sure that I changed the envelope a little bit to be a little bit more stab-like. So, and then in this section, some different saw stacks. Again, I'm pretty sure they're Ableton stock presets that I've manipulated more or less to fit my needs. In this case, they're just two different octaves sitting on top of each other. And then sitting underneath those is a sort of dry stab. So this is one that I just made an operator because making dry sounds in operator is pretty easy. And together with these other saw stacks and these other trance stabs, they kind of create, it's just kind of the weight of them in the mix kind of comes in with the drums and everything else and just ends up overpowering everything else. You'll kind of hear the effect of it. And you can hear that dry one right underneath. So this effectively makes up the basis of the intro. There's some sort of reverse effects here. I'm pretty sure that those were just made out of me stretching some white noise or some distortion or something like that. It doesn't look crazy, but it looks like something that I've rendered given this name here. There's something similar. Down here, there's some like a stock big crash reverse. Let's listen to it. essentially a pitch down crash with some reverb on it. Pretty dense dry reverb. I've cut out some of the lows here so it doesn't rumble quite as much, but not on the input. And that kind of makes it sound a little bit more natural, kind of lets the reverb open up. I've loosened up on the decay time here and kind of made the decays a little bit shorter. Not much else has changed. It's still pretty stock. I've turned down some of the reflections and let the diffusion of the sound kind of be a little bit louder. So it gives it a little bit more of a roomy tone. But then I've cut out some of the mids after the sound to kind of shape it to the mix, because at this point, some of what's going on is kind of busy around 1K. You can hear it in these synth stabs and these sort of things that are going on. Let's get into the drop. So this is the interesting bit. Coming into these trance stabs here, there's a little drum break, or I guess like sound effects break, excuse me. And this makes up 5 different sounds here. That's because I had to just assemble it by hand. I didn't really want to do it timing-wise in a drum rack. So let's break it down. This whoop, not sure where this comes from. I think this is from an English dude named Kuro. As you can see, there's some filtering going on down here to kind of filter out the top end, because his sound sounded kind of digital coming from like Serum. And then a little bit of frequency shifting and overdrive to kind of build that top end back up in a more harmonically friendly way. I do this quite often, actually. Sometimes if a sound isn't fitting quite right in my spectrum, and it's a dangerous thing to do because you're sort of you're making the sound more lo-fi. But cutting out highs or cutting out harmonics and tones that don't quite sound right and then building them back up with distortions or erosion is a powerful effect for that. It's essentially a frequency-based distortion, and it can actually help add harmonics onto the very end of that. There's a lot of different ways to do that. A lot of them can sound very fake, but distortion is a beautiful thing in bass music, and this song specifically, especially, is built around a lot of different kinds of distortion. There's this sound. There's a very, very short whip here, just leading into this clap. Which is built out of 2 different sounds. A snare sound, which comes from a pack that I quite like, of some very realistic sounding drums. And then this really, really terrible hey sound, which uses, I guess, a little bit of room reverb, very tight reverb. Big though. This is kind of one of those reverbs that you would use more as a utility for the sound to spread it out, which is what I'm doing here. Then adding some sort of distortion on the high end, a fair amount to make it sound kind of like a bit sound effect. And then these toms down, which are again taken from a pack. A lot of the time I would actually play these out, but I liked this weird sort of delay that it has on it. You'll hear what I'm talking about here. So it's not 100% clean. When sounds are ripped from a pack like that, they can sound really nice and jarring and a little bit violent in your mix because they don't belong. They're ripped from something else. Again, a little bit of low-pass filtering just because I felt it was a little too extreme on the high end for where it fell in the song. If you sort of compress those mids together in a section and then open back up, like I'm about to do for this drop, that's a way to sort of introduce drama into your mix. So, yeah, that break, quite simple. Into the trance stabs that I showed you earlier. And then into this drop. Let's listen to it. So let's start with one of the coolest sounds that I made for this project, this car skid. I had a sound that I heard in my head, and I wasn't quite sure I'd be able to make it, but I wanted a sound like a car skidding. And funny enough, I actually have a BBC complete sound effect library here, and I was able to find a car skidding. It didn't quite sound exactly like how I wanted, so I added some distortion on it, added some compression on it. This frequency shifter is a nice way of adding some strange sort of harmonics and noise in here. Here's the crux of the sound, really. This is what makes it sound so hollow. You know, without this, the high feedback on that delay gives it a really metallic ring to it. That's kind of what, you know, jumps out of the mix. If you want to get nice metallic sounds, mess around with these high feedback times and then these low, like less than 10 millisecond times, and they'll change. It'll change very drastically depending on what you put it at, because harmonics are actually canceling each other out as they sort of start to delay on top of each other. It's something that's kind of hard to explain in just a few words, but the harmonics are just stacking up and creating really metallic resonances. Very cool sound. Repeats every 4 bars, 8 bars here at 155. Let's go into this drum rack. Now this is essentially like the basis of the drop. Let's just solo it so you can watch the pattern. So as you can tell down here, there's a kick, a multi-kick. That actually makes up the basis of that 808-y sort of drop. Oh God, it'll never stop. This is an almost like unprocessed kick from a pack I'm not even entirely sure where it came from. But this long 808 is actually a guitar pinch harmonic that's been pitched down. I'm not sure in here. Yeah, I guess a little bit in here. And distorted and fuzzed out. And then turned into a bass. So it's actually a guitar tone. I was messing around with it earlier in the project down here in this muted track. So those raw sounds ended up becoming the basis for the bass. The kick is repeated here, so that it can actually be used just dry without the other one. This kick and this 808 are triggering at the same time because I've gone in over here on the ins and outs, and I've turned them on to the same note. So anytime a C1 is played, both of these trigger. Here's the basic snare. Kind of sounds like a heavily mic'd up rim shot. I put... Oh yeah, there's a little bit of delay turned on down here. Eventually, kind of comes in for effect. And you can hear that in the background. Again, not crazy. I wanted the very dry sounds. Here's something that I've chopped up. Again, it's a sample of a very, very short, like bitty sound. Just like to use little sounds like that instead of like hi-hats from time to time. They just make for really nice sounding glitch music. Let's see what other sounds we have in here. Another dry kick for some reason, I'm not sure. Oh, there's our hi-hat. A very predictable snare. But it sounds good in trap music. So that 808 is basically the most complex thing here. So let's go through and let's break it down. Let's listen to it on its own first. So that 808 sound by itself actually shows up in the song earlier, right here. And in the drop, it's just being filtered out with an LFO. Right here. This little LFO section on sampler. It gets turned on. And you can see the rate gets modulated. Let me just find those modulations. There's quite a lot of modulations. All right, here we go. The synced rate. Watch this and this. So basically it only re-triggers when the kick is being triggered, but the LFO is going all the time. And there's a little bit of a pitch envelope on it as well, hence why it sounds like it's sort of like gliding down. This pitch envelope on it, set for about a second, and about a second on the release, just kind of gives it a boom, and just instead of being a straight tone. So that's kind of what you're hearing when the pitch goes down. It's like, it's not two different notes, it's just a pitch envelope on the thing. It's kind of a trick of the ear. I cut out some of the mids, again, to let the snare pop through. The same thing that I did on the strings, sort of down below. This was probably something that I did in like the last sort of step of mixing. I can't quite remember. Let's finish up talking about this here. This gritty bass, people really like this sound. Not complex. The crux of the sound, love that word. The reason that it sounds so good is because it's another one of those guitar pinch harmonics. And it sounded really dirty because it was very heavily fuzzed out, and it was sort of in between sitting in noise and sitting in a tone. A little bit of an EQ. A little bit of erosion up top. Set to the wide noise setting. Just kind of helps give it a little bit of edge. And then I want to say, yeah, a little bit of trash, which is a really powerful effect for distortion and convolution. Basically, that means that there's a little bit of this ripped cone in here. It basically sounds like it's coming through a ripped cone. You can tell the differences that it's making. And then there's actually nothing in the trash channel. Just a little bit of this ripped cone, a little bit of stereo separation, a little bit of width to give it a little bit of edge in the mix. This lead, also not crazy at all. In fact, it's probably the most simple thing in this song. This pitch envelope coming in every single time the note is triggered. And it's just basically a saw with a little bit of sine modulation on top and a little bit of auto pan to move it around the mix. And the reason that it sounds so nice in the mix is because of this group. And this is really why I enjoy mixing in Ableton. These groups within groups, really powerful thing. So there's a little bit of an EQ to kind of get the drums to stand out and kind of get everything to sound a little bit more analog because it's being pushed in a couple of directions. Some really intense wave shaping happening here. So let's turn some of these off and hear what it sounds like. Pretty dramatic difference. So with all these back on. Starting to sound a little warmer. And now this is just going to be the heat on top. pretty much the same thing. A little bit of that convolution that you heard up, that I showed you earlier. A little width, a little bit of stereo separation on top, but again, only at about 20% wetness. But there's multi-stage distortion. This crunchy garage, which just sort of like adds a really nice drive to the top of everything. Not super wet, not super loud, but it sort of heats up the more it gets into the high end to let that bass sort of stand on its own. And then some fuzz on the very top end to kind of get it to sizzle. And this is where the wetness comes in. So let's listen. Some compression on top to give it glue. You can hear these like really short release times, which I don't normally recommend these release times, or these attack times to be completely different quite like this, but it helps this drum kit kind of come together. But all the release times are about the same, giving the bass a little bit more time to move underneath. Again, not always recommended, but the way that the kick punches through, I just wanted it to sound damaged, a little bit analog. Most of the heavy lifting's being done on that snare. And you can hear that distortion brings the lead up a lot. So when it comes down to this kind of thing, breaking it apart, a lot of it comes down to gain staging. So gain staging wise, this drum rack is really loud being run into the mixer, but this lead is behind everything. And I originally got a comment from a friend of mine talking about how this lead should be up in the mix, but to me the lead was the bass line. And that squelchy, grimy, dirty bass line felt like it needed to overwhelm everything else. And with the lead being underneath everything and the distortion being on top of it, the lead actually comes up in the mix to the point where it's in your ear, kind of on the same level as that drum rack. It's just distorted by everything else around it. Just becomes sort of like harmonically distorted. So this is the second build. Similar to the first, but there's a 303 acid bass in here. Similar, but that whole extra section in the middle sort of throws it off. So let's break that down. This acid bass is coming from a plugin called the TAL Noisemaker. TAL being the company, if I remember right. I think this is a freeware synth. It's not that crazy. This isn't actually the one that I thought it was. I thought it was a bass line that I did this in. But that's also a freeware synth that they make. Just has a really nice squelchy filter that I really enjoy using. The ability to choose all of these different sort of like ladder filters and things like that. Just sounds nice, sounds gritty. So not crazy, just sounds really nice. The trouble was making it sound 3D and kind of high def. So let's mute all of these. Here's the raw sound by itself. Again, the differences aren't too drastic, but if you just heard that kind of on its own in the mix, you really wouldn't be able to tell that it was being affected so heavily. Trash played a big part of that. A lot of fuzz on this, if I remember right. Yeah, 100% wet, some pretty heavy fuzz happening here. That helmet convolution always sounds pretty good and bassy. This ride that comes in, not actually very complex. It's mostly the sound. I just spread it out with the chorus just for the sake of the mix. Sounds nice and heavy. And then this part. What essentially happens here is this bass starts to get distorted with this redux here, this bit reduction. And then I believe the whole drum rack gets this filter put on it, as well as this erosion. So if you really want to create some violence in your mix, just start putting filters on like big things, like the whole group of the drop, or, you know, put some panning effects or something like that. Loud, soft, bassy, trebly, those kind of dynamic changes happening very quickly are really violent. So, you know, here this drum rack mix going to just like this almond break that's being chopped up with that stereo spreading ping pong delay that I was talking about earlier, set at 2.5 milliseconds, just makes it sound really gross and violent. Back into the bassy drum rack. So this drop is not much different. It's actually just constructed out of the same things. The sync rate is being changed quite a bit more often here in this part. Something that I forgot to point out is that the filter frequency and the resonance here are also changing. So you can actually hear the resonance and the filter frequency kind of increase. Constant motion really gives things a lifelike feel. Not much different happening here. There's this 303 cuts back in a couple of times. You know, I get comments that my music sounds really lifelike a lot, and I think that one of the biggest reasons for that is because of the way that I do my effects chains. You know, all of these different sounds are happening well before I do heavy distortion. So this heavy distortion drives everything up in the mix and kind of like gets it to sit out really evenly and sound really lifelike, but I still have the ability to turn everything off and mute things and sound really live, which happens quite a lot in this song. You know, you'll notice that at the end of a lot of my chains, there'll be utilities where I can adjust gains and I can make things, I can mute things that might have tails that need to be muted or too much distortion on them, so they sort of trail over. It's just a nice clean way to mix, and I enjoy mixing cleanly, but then within the effects and within these instrument parts themselves, kind of giving me a way to do things that are ugly. So, you know, when these filter resonances start to feed back, they could sound really ugly, but they don't, because I have a big chain of, you know, EQ and distortion and some compression that helps clean it up and make it sound less ugly. You know, you notice that with the effects off, the snare was really loud, and that was kind of a way for me to play into the distortion and the way that distortion would make space for that snare and sort of chunk it out of the mix. So let's try to get into like this outro here, because the outro sounds a lot more complex than it is. It just makes use of a couple of effects that are really, really easy to deal with. Okay, nothing actually all that crazy going on here, just clever use of chopping and sample reuse. Going into that, you hear something quite similar to what happened in this second drop here. But it's not happening up here in the drum rack, and that's because I've cut it up. So I've used something in Ableton, the ability to record from other groups. So you can see over here in this input-output section, I've changed it to record from the drop group after all of the effects. And so what's happened is it's recorded out this audio track, which I have then cut up. So, you know, if I pulled all this out, you'd actually hear the drop as it was. This is the drop as it was. And now I've cut it up again. Some things just have to be done by hand, and this is one of those things. Nothing crazy. There's literally no effects on the track. I just wanted to chop it up. However, going into this granulated outro, I knew that I wanted to stretch it. So Granulator and granular synthesis is a really interesting way of creating textures from very small bits of sound. And so I've taken this this sort of like this, basically, this break. I've taken this break and sort of chopped it up with Granulator. So what's happening here is it's being cut up into very small pieces, grains. You can see them playing back. And it's scanning along this file at a rate that is 2,800 times slower than the original sample, but at a curve that lets it sort of kick into the sample a little bit before it starts to slow down. So you can see that happening. When it first hits, it zooms into the file a little bit, and then it starts to slow down, which lets that kick kind of come through again. So what you're hearing now is just the file playing granularly. I'm changing the grain size. And then it re-triggers here, which is why it gives another big thing like that. And this is all happening on beat with the song. Technically, there's 8 bars, 8 bars, 8 bars, 4 bars, 4 bars, whatever. And then that redux on the outro, kind of making it sound like it's been lo-fi. Just downsamples it, a little bit of distortion. This filter to make it sound, you know, bassy. And then I've turned the spray up to kind of introduce silence and let it break up quite a bit. And that's essentially the song. There's some extra effects down here at the very bottom. You can see when the synth re-triggers, I wanted to get a little bit of an extra kick in there, which is why it sounds like there's a very loud kick, because there is a very loud kick in there to help play against the distortion. These big reverse cymbals with reverb. Kind of help add a sense of like timing, and they're sort of DJ tools. Beyond that, there's really not much as far as arrangement goes. It's a very simple song with not that many tracks to it, but let's try and break down what's going on inside some of these tracks themselves. So we've already been through this string sample. This drop group, we've kind of walked through a little bit, but let's talk about why Trash works this way. I've gone into Trash and I've adjusted the graph of its settings. And essentially what this means is that it's going, you can kind of drag and drop. So this means that that it's going into the convolution first, which kind of makes it sound like it's in a room or in an object or something like that. Like maybe there's a speaker in a space, and I've given it just a little bit of a helmety sound, as Trash would say. And then there's some parallel processing here happening across 3 different bands: the bass band, the mid-range band, and the high band. In each of these, there's a little bit of distortion. You can see the curve changing just a little bit, with a little bit of fuzz on the high end. So Trash is very powerful. It can allow you to do far more extreme sounds than this, but I just wanted a little bit of a touch. I believe later on in the song, in these sections where it goes very heavy, I've introduced some digital artifacts, maybe? I'm not entirely sure if this... Yeah, this mix does get automated. Same here. Just a little bit of distortion on top. And there's your drum rack, essentially. I've muted the channel at the end when it goes into this chopped up audio bit so that you don't hear it. But it's still there. And there's a little bit of gain automation on the whole thing to give it drama. This is something that I've learned from working with audio for a while. Sometimes, if you just want to create drama in your mix, it helps to adjust your volumes and stuff. So in these builds leading into the drop, there's about a 3.55 dB volume difference. I think we've gone through the car skid effects and the gritty bass. Yeah, this noisemaker, again, it's just a very dry sound with a lot of distortion, a little bit of reverb, and you've probably seen these chains of compressors on the end. These are the sidechain compression for the whole track. So this is sidechain to the kick, the other kick, the dry kick, and the other dry kick. Interesting. Still am not entirely sure why that one's there, but I'll trust my prior judgment. The break itself actually has no effects on it because it's being routed into this group. These strings, okay, so here's a multi-band dynamics use. So these very quiet sounds are actually being boosted quite a lot. This is what's called an expander. So typically compressors compress loud sounds, which it actually is doing here as well. But expanders bring up very quiet sounds. This is bringing up any quiet sounds, any sounds underneath this threshold of 34 dB by 1.25 times its original volume. For the most part, expanders probably shouldn't have too steep of ratios because the sounds can sound quite fake or the noise floor can be brought up. But that might be something that you want to do in electronic music. You can see my utility mutes taking place. So all these reverb from the trance stabs doesn't carry over into this little break before the drops. So this looks like part of the preset here, this wavetable preset. There was some echo on it that I actually turned off. You can actually see like the delays and stuff like that. A little bit of chorus that's not on. A little bit of chorus that is on. Some saturation. And yeah, this looks like it's all just to kind of make it sound very nice and live. Oh no, this chorus is on. I take it back. Yep. This just looks like it's going to make it sound kind of analog. Yeah, so these large stack of saws just have some reverb on them to make them sound natural. And again, the overdrive after the sound itself to make it sound warm. In this case, there's actually some EQ and some compression going on at the end, just because I wanted them to sit really nicely with each other and not really conflict too much. They're actually EQ'd against each other, if I remember right. So this has got a little dip around 600 hertz, and this has got a little dip around 1k hertz. So they don't interfere with each other too much, with the snare too much, or anything like that. Same with this dry bass pad. It actually has some EQ cuts. Looks like, so it didn't conflict with these trance stabs. And cutting EQ generally sounds better than boosting EQ. If you cut with relatively like small cuts and boost with relatively large cuts, that mimics how our ears hear real world sounds. All of these strings that you see basically just have some compression on them and some EQ to kind of sit with each other. Nothing crazy. I actually don't think that strings should have all that much on them. just because strings tend to sound better when they breathe. And you can make really drastic changes to the sound just by altering compression or EQ. And yeah, these reverse effects are mostly utilitarian down here. Again, that was probably just a stretch sound that has been filtered out. And yeah, I messed with. If you know how to use your sounds in good ways and really utilitarian ways, you can sort of make them go really far. You know, this is a decent ride, it's a decent snare, and it's a decent kick, based out of 808s that I designed using just gritty sounds. It doesn't take much. It's actually better if you don't overthink it. Let's talk about these return tracks. I didn't even notice them for the moment. It looks like a decently tight reverb. Ballad reverb is actually kind of a nice preset because it's a nice large sounding room/hall with not too long of a decay on it. It sounds quite natural. Ableton's reverb doesn't always sound natural. You sort of have to mess with these shape and density settings in order to get something that matches the room that you want to hear. Yeah, I won't lie. Oh yeah, here we go. This bit clap and probably, yeah, the crowd are on this reverb. Just to give it a little bit of extra space. This ping pong delay. Another ping pong delay. These are just insert effects so that I didn't have to, return effects so that I didn't have to adjust the audio of whatever track I was working with. Everything here looks fairly basic as far as sound design goes. And this is something that I've done more over time. I think if you had caught me 2 or 3 years ago, I would have had much more complex chains in my audio. And certainly there are some complex chains in places, and some really convoluted sounds. You know, this Granulator outro basically coming from an entire section of the song that's just chopped and destroyed. You could do a lot with just a little. It took me only, 15 minutes to do that entire outro, and it sounds like the most destroyed audio on the whole song. Technically it is, it's the most glitchy. But gain staging is a very important thing. I think these very quiet sounds in the beginning, you can see that these string sounds are coming in extremely quiet. The very bottom of the range. Decent use of sidechain helps. But yeah, these big dynamic changes were a very purposeful thing that I did in the mix. Sometimes I even go so far as to automate gain changes on the master itself between the quieter parts and the drops and the very loud parts. Things like that can sometimes make a big difference in how your song is perceived to the ear. So yeah, this is not complex as far as things go. It makes basic use of some of Ableton's audio tools and really clever use of some of its sampling tools. And I implore people to kind of explore the basics of Ableton before diving too far into anything that would be considered more complex. Because as you saw, pretty much all of this is stock Ableton with the more ear-catching sounds being delivered via Isotope's Trash. I think on the master I used a tool called Waves MV2, which is something that balances out the sound, your loud and soft sounds, and kind of helps the master sit a little bit more evenly before I use it before anything else in my chain, because it can make those big dynamic differences a little bit more smooth in your songs. But besides that, there's just a fair amount of compression and maximization on the master. I really prefer my masters to sound natural and close to how the original mix sounded. If you have any more questions about this song, let me know. I'm willing to make other videos and go over other parts of the song, synths or samples or any other parts of the arrangement or the mix down that you're interested in. Just shoot me an email, leave a comment wherever this is hosted, and let me know. My name is Kalen Bonet, also known as Zero Tep. Thanks for watching this breakdown.